but this is really kind of only for short time. And so I wanted to grab a minute just to do a little bit of thank yous, and especially the coordinating committee, who is basically Russell, combination of Peace Council staff, Carol, Jessica, Amelia, Judy Bello, Elliot, Peg, George and Judy Hamanich, and Jim Clune, who's in the clink. And obviously a lot of other people helped. Thank you to the banner droppers. This is a wonderful experience for Syracuse. That's really great. And of course, again, recognition of the guys in prison, and to the people who came from far away. We have folks from Atlanta, from Massachusetts, from New York, from Boston, Virginia, etc. Hawaii, some blonde from Hawaii. All right, so you all know if you've been involved in any kind of organizing like this. Wow. Okay, it's a big deal to do this, and here in Syracuse, we're kind of hicks from the sticks. We don't do this like they do in Washington every other week. So thank you so much to the people that did the work to get us to be able to be together. And again, start searching your soul for thinking about the resistance tomorrow. The more we have, the more powerful it is. Thanks.
Warsofmine.org. Well worth it following. Bruce Gagnon has been doing the global network, a lot of work on tracking the use of space for military purposes. And your best website is
spaceforpeace.org.
Spaceforpeace.org. And of course, Kathy Kelly, who has been doing that incredible humanitarian work in Afghanistan, not just going to visit, but being there, working with the people on a really grassroots base. And yours is created on us.
DCNV.
DCNV.
Voices.
DCNV, Victor, November.
Voices created online.
I don't want to waste any more of our time. Time is really precious here. Kathy?
Yes, it must have been maybe 5 years ago now that Jeremy Scahill was in the kitchen at Voices for Creative Nonviolence, pounding the table, saying, Kathy, when are you and the rest of the peace movement going to get in touch with the 21st century military? And I said, soon. I had no idea what he was talking about. And then I started Googling MQ-9 predators. He mentioned something about that. And so began to grow more familiar with the reality that Nick Turse has recently labeled blurredness, or jointness. And I know that David and Bruce are much more adept at being able to describe this, but it is almost like an unaccountable spaghetti of the drone operators, the special forces, special joint operations forces, which combine forces from different parts of the world, and certainly from the U.S. military, now Blackwater, most recently renamed Academy, A-C-A-D-E-M-I, is building a 10-acre camp outside of Kabul that they're naming Camp Integrity. And it's to train joint special operations forces, and it is going to accomplish this intactness, integrity, of weaving together these various forces, and then cybersecurity, and of course the CIA gets woven in there as well. So we have this new military that very much depends on surveillance of the drones. Even if a weaponized drone isn't being used, they're using the drone surveillance. The RAND Corporation says it would require 100,000 Air Force analysts. They only have 70,000 now, to adequately describe patterns of life just in Afghanistan, where they're constantly collecting footage, surveilling the people of Afghanistan. So I would like to take my time this morning just to tell you a story about a woman and a drone. And this actually comes from a time before Jeremy pounded on the table realities, but I started to reflect back on it and think about it more. I was in Lebanon. It was 2006, the summer of 2006, when there was what was called the Israeli-Hezbollah war. Condoleezza Rice had said to the Israeli government, don't sign a ceasefire. We can still get you a Raytheon-produced bunker buster. And so as they were racing to get the bunker buster to the Israeli Defense Forces, in the town of Hana, in southern Lebanon, families were trying to figure out how they could best shelter their children while the missiles were pounding down. And engineers had said, there's a shelter, there's a basement in this building, and we've examined that there's nothing the Israelis have that could attack this basement shelter. And so the families had their children stay just overnight inside that shelter, but the bunker buster arrived on time before a ceasefire was signed. And so the bunker buster destroyed the shelter. And when I came into the town of Hana, I had already seen taped on the sides of taxi cab drivers' doors the bodies of two immaculate little children nestled in each other's arms. And what killed those two little girls was that the force of the explosion destroyed their internal organs. Their bodies were immaculate. And also taped on cab drivers' doors the photo of a helmeted relief worker holding the body of little Zahra as he had pulled her out of the rubble. And then when the bombing stopped, the parents could finally gather together for a funeral for their children. And it's at that point that Ramsey Kaisley and Michael Birmingham and Father Mokhtar and I walked into town and asked, could you tell us where the massacre was? And so we literally walked right into the funeral. And I went with Farah to where the women were. And there wasn't always adequate translation, so we sat quietly. But we began to piece together some of what had happened. Now you see, there was a drone circling the skies the whole time. It was audible. And eventually, the mother sent her son to go and get pictures of those newspapers, from the newspapers. And then she sent her son to get one more picture. And it was the picture of a little girl with a serious face and large saucer eyes and tousled hair. You could just imagine a smile breaking across the face of that little girl. And first, the mother, who was wearing a medical hood and a neck brace, tapped the plastic over the picture, and she fixed me with a direct look and enunciated very clearly this question for me as she tapped the plastic over her little daughter's face. Is she the terrorist? And then wincing, she pointed to the sky above, and she asked, didn't they know? These drones above that can see everything? Didn't they see my Zahara? Every morning she wrote to me, just we sent her to be safe. Well, the drones will never know, never ever know what it's like for a mother's outstretched arms to ache longingly for a child that will never run to her again. That little girl would have been 13 this year. So we have to take that mother's question. Who is the terrorist? She pointed to the skies above and asked, who is the terrorist? We have to know. I'm so sorry. That we will, something could maybe go down a little bit. That we will terrify each. I could try the high school study teachers. We have to know. I'm so sorry. Yeah? We have to know that.
scarf around.
Mike.
I'm sorry?
Mike.
The scarf around.
Okay. We have to know that we will terrify each other if we don't start to come to grips with, as what Jeremy said, the 21st century military. Because the greatest terror we all do face is the terror of climate change and global warming. And while we are allowing the military to take it all, the military-industrial complex and the security-industrial complex, to dominate our resources, our ingenuity, our creativity, our funding, we won't have what's needed in order to come to grips with what's an impending catastrophe, no doubt. We have to listen to the scientists. We're all at the same risk as the Mother Zahra was underneath the drones, but we're not seeing it. The risks we face, catastrophes from famine, from water shortages, from the climate changes that will induce massive migrations amongst people who are suffering from famine and from shortages, the potential for pandemic diseases. These are the terrors that we should be grappling with, but we can't do it if we continue to allow the military to take off. And how does the military force us into obesity? They keep telling us your jobs depend on us. You rock this boat, you'll lose your jobs. And it can look that way until you listen to Bruce Gagnon explain the results of the Massachusetts Amherst study, which says that in fact more jobs, many, many more jobs would be created if we started to make things that are good for people, if we started to produce things that would help us face our current real situation. And that's why Ed Kennan and Jim Kuhn and Brian Haynes and Mark Seville Carter are in jail right now. They're thinking about us and they're thinking about it. And that's why it's important to go to jail. And that's why it's important to be grateful to every person in this Syracuse region and beyond who has helped to educate us. And it's taken years, but as Elliot said, we're ahead, we're getting ahead to educate us about the real world we're actually moving forward into, so that we can recognize that because of the children, because we are all part of one another, we need far more intelligence than the drones and all of their surveillance and all their analysis can ever offer us. So let's be smart, let's be together, let's catch courage from one another. Courage is always the ability to control our fears. And remember the Jesuit national anthem, be not afraid. Thank you.
He says, now in the 20th century, as it moves towards sanity or mad despair, the slayer needs merely to touch a button and death is on the wing, blindly, blotting out the remote, the unknown people, holocausts of death, veritable mass productions of death, spreading an abysmal desolation over whole communities and the fertile body of the earth. In these days, I lost my last illusion about war. I had called myself a war reporter. It would be more accurate to call myself a reporter of death. Death in all of its ghastliest forms. From the Korean War, where over 1 million civilians were killed by the United States and their allies. And today we're creating enemies faster than we can kill them. I believe that this is no accident. It's not being done because our government is incompetent or inept. I remember once hearing Secretary of Endless War Donald Rumsfeld tell the media, "We plan everything." And I think generally that's true. Targeted assassinations have become standard operating procedure for the CIA and the Pentagon. Special forces teams have long made use of military satellites to select targets, get groups using helicopters to and from the kill zones, and then conduct follow-up space surveillance to see how the job went. Now, even more high-tech death squads use armed drones to do the same dirty work, targeted killing from afar. These death squads use the same satellite technology to carry out their evil missions. I live in Maine, and our new independent Senator, Angus King, recently called drones a very smart artillery shell, a more humane weapon. We've been organizing in our state to get the public to push back against this kind of thinking. We've also been working with the ACLU in Maine to pass a bill in the state legislature that would require police agencies to obtain warrants before they can use drones to snoop on the public. Maine's Attorney General, the former Vice President of the Democratic Party in our state, opposes the warrant provision of the bill and wants police to have the power to make their own surveillance rules. She calls drones, quote, an economic driver for the state, unquote, and insists on having language in the bill that would allow the weapons testing of drones in the northern part of Maine. Right now, there's a political stalemate because of the pressure coming out of the peace movement, churches across the state, civil libertarians, and the bill is tabled. More than 500 aerospace corporations today are eager to develop this new drone market just in the United States. The drone industry is pushing back hard against those who say that local police should be required to have search warrants before using drones to spy on the public. Industry lawyers say we have nothing to fear, that all we have to do is ask local police and they will be transparent about the drone use. Yeah, a good laugh line, right? Throughout our history, though, we've seen that the government has over and over again used every available means to monitor innocent people and to suppress legitimate dissent, and drones will be no different. There's a $2 billion, that's with a B, 1 million square foot facility being built by the National Security Administration, the NSA, outside of Salt Lake City in Utah. It's a phone, fax, and email data storage and analysis warehouse called the Utah Data Station. Everything about the facility is top secret. It's scheduled to open this summer. It's the Taj Mahal of the police state. It appears that there will be 6 permanent drone test centers across the nation. Communities in 37 states have applied, including Hancock Field, to be the host of one of those 6 sites. Originally, the plan called for 4 of these test bases across the nation, but your senator from New York, Schumer, a quote-unquote good Democrat, pushed for 6 of them, knowing that it would help shoehorn Hancock onto the list. The military-industrial complex is America's job program today. What does that say about the soul of our nation? That we have to make weapons and endless war in order to provide jobs for folks so they can put food on the tables for their families. There's now an effort to turn northern Maine, former air base, now closed, into a missile defense deployment site on the East Coast. Congress has mandated a study to determine whether Maine or Fort Drum, here in upstate New York, would be selected as a missile defense interceptor deployment site. These so-called missile defense systems are now being used by U.S. and NATO to surround Russia and China. Infrared and radio band sensors used by the military can now peer through clouds and foliage and even detect and hear people inside their homes. During the last few years of the U.S. occupation of Iraq, monitored Baghdad 24/7, turning the city into an equivalent of a convenience store crammed full of security cameras. This technology is called persistent surveillance and is made possible by new generations of very expensive military satellites. It costs huge amounts of money to build these satellites and then launch them on rockets that blow up from time to time. By 2020, the Pentagon hopes to have a new layered space surveillance architecture in place that will be able to integrate space, cyberspace, and ground combat through robotics for the delivery of a seamless web of global domination, or as they like to call it, full spectrum dominance. This basically means that they would control conflict at every level, on the ground, in the oceans, on the air, in space, and in cyberspace. The mainstream media commentators mislead just a bit by saying that drones lower the cost of warfare. And most people just accept this as the gospel truth. They overlook the point that drones are connected to this huge industrial project that has put into space a constellation of satellites that are linked to ground stations all over the planet, that relay their signals in real time, split-second time, from places like Creech Air Force Base in Nevada or here in Hancock. These downlink stations in Australia, England, Greenland, New Zealand, Colorado, and other places around the planet help fly the drones. They're the triggers. The satellites are the triggers for this very expensive way of waging war. In June 2012, the second flight of the new military space plane, the X-37, touched down at Vandenberg Air Force Base after 469 days in orbit. This unmanned super drone is a first strike attack system, part of the global strike doctrine, now underway at the Strategic Command. In an annual war game set in the year 2016, the U.S. military launches an attack on China, and the first weapon that is used is this military space plane, the X-37. The Pentagon says that our role in the U.S. under corporate globalization of the world economy will be security export, and that we won't have conventional jobs anymore. We won't be making shoes and refrigerators and televisions and phones. Instead, we'll build weapons for endless war and send our kids overseas to die for oil and precious mineral extraction on behalf of the corporations. All of this won't come cheap. Some years ago in the industry publication, Space News, they said we've got to come up with a dedicated funding source in order to pay for all this. And we have, they said. We're now sending our lobbyists to Washington to secure this funding source. They called it the entitlement programs that officially are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and what's left of the welfare program. These are the programs that the military-industrial complex intends to defund in order to pay for endless space-directed war. The militarization of everything around us is a spiritual sickness. Lakota holy man, Lane Deer, talked about the green frog skin, the dollar bill, and how the white man was blinded by his love for the dollar. His spiritual connection to the Mother Earth is broken. Thus, we need a transformation of the heart and our entire way of thinking. And we should repeatedly be calling, as part of that transformation, for the conversion of the military-industrial complex. As Kathy said, UMass Amherst Economics Department has done the definitive study that shows when our tax dollars are used on military, they create less jobs than in any other instance, whether we fund healthcare, education, or building rail systems. In fact, when you build rail systems, you double the number of jobs that you get from military production.
Otherwise, you get more jobs, even tax cuts. It's worse than nothing, military spending. My name's David Swanson, by the way. I have very mixed emotions about being here to talk about the most unpleasant topic there is. But to do so with people willing to face it, to be here with Ruth and Kathy, and to be speaking to people who are already doing more than I am, already doing what needs to be done. How many of you saw a hearing in the Senate on Tuesday on drones? Some of you. This was the typical hearing up to a point, right? The Obama administration sent nobody. Most of the witnesses were your usual professors and so forth who didn't know any more than you do. But there was a young man named Fareah al-Muslimi who came from Yemen, whose village had been hit by a drone strike last week. This was as if that young girl's body that Kathy talked about had been brought in and put on the table in the U.S. Senate committee hearing room. This was Heinrich Himmler going out to see a little bit of one of the mass executions he'd ordered and being unable to stand it, and crawling back to his office and creating gas chambers so that the guards wouldn't have to see the victims. And this is what they did after Muslimi spoke. They turned to the other witnesses. Now, what would you like to say? They didn't want to hear that, but it was remarkable for that to be there in that room. But what struck me the most in this hearing was the testimony of one of your usual law professors, a woman named Rosa Brooks, who put very succinctly, I thought, what the common wisdom is. And she said, if these drone strikes are part of a war, they're legal and they're good. If they're not part of a war, they're murder. One word, the word I've been trying to get everybody to use, damn it, for years, murder. And she said, we don't know if they're part of a war and perfectly fine, or not part of a war and therefore murder, because we haven't seen the secret memos. Now, so what's the substantive difference between being part of a war and not being part of a war? It's nothing you can observe here in the heartland of the empire. It's nothing that Mr. al-Muslimi can observe in his village at the other end, the receiving end. It's something that can be put into a secret memo and stuffed in an envelope and put in a drawer that distinguishes perfectly fine from murder. Now, we know the facts. The facts are hardly in dispute. A single individual, President Barack Obama, is going through a list of people, men, women, and children, on Tuesdays, picking which ones to have murdered, having them murdered. And most of the people he's having murdered, most of the houses and buildings he's targeting, he doesn't know who's in there, doesn't know their names at all. Many of them have been identified as run-of-the-mill resistors to a foreign occupation of their or a neighboring nation. A handful. You know, most of the people are just innocent, have just been too close to the target. Most of the targets have not been identified. Many have been identified as resistors, and a handful have been identified as imminent, meaning eventual or theoretical, threats to the United States of America. And he's having these people murdered. Now, in civilized war, in humane war, murder is allowed, but not torture, not rape, not theft, not shoplifting, not cheating on your taxes, just murder. Murder is the one crime that gets allowed. This is civilized war. In uncivilized war, which is what many of our fellow citizens think of, it's very hard to understand how the worst thing possible, murder on a large scale, is allowed. Why in the world can't you have a little torture too? It doesn't make sense to them, right? And so you have these two views of war competing, civilized and uncivilized. They're both wrong. They're both wrong. What is exposed in recognizing that the drone strikes are murder is that war itself is criminal mass murder. This is what we have to arrive at. And this distinction of whether it's murder or it's perfectly fine is absolutely regardless of where or when. It's the entire globe, every day of the year from here on out. And when young men of so-called fighting age in predominantly Muslim countries kids are killed, they are posthumously identified as enemies. What would this make you think if you were a young Muslim man and you were taught that killing is righteous and killing is everywhere and the war is everywhere? How do people accused of creating bombs in Boston think altogether differently from people who blow up peaceful villages in Yemen? Like, this is the mindset we are spreading. I just got off a plane from Dallas. We were dedicating the Bush Library, and I greeted some people in their fancy Sunday best coming out of the dedication ceremony with the 5 felons, with the 5 former and current presidents, and a woman came up and started screaming at me, "Why aren't you protesting Obama? Why don't you people protest Obama? Where have you been for 5 years?" And I said, "Ma'am, can you read?" I was wearing a shirt that said, "Arrest Bush and Obama." "Ma'am, can you read? Can you see?" And she said, "Yeah, but not all of the rest of those people, not all of those banners, you're not." And she was absolutely right. She was absolutely right. I hadn't seen most of my friends for 5 years that were at this reunion in Dallas. And so then she turns to a different angle and says, "Well, but if Obama does it, then why don't you like it? Why don't you approve of it?" Because this is how people think. You're with Bush or you're with Obama. We have to be against murder. We have a president who wanted us to know before the election that he goes through that list of men, women, and children on Tuesdays and has them murdered. He wanted us to know that because of the Bush-Cheney years and how we did not hold them accountable for their crimes. So we have to be against murder, we have to be for economic conversion, we have to be for counter-recruitment, and we have to be against each new war. And we have to be against each new war, not just because of the cost to U.S. men and women, who, by the way, were 0.3%, not 100% of the deaths in the war on Iraq. We have to be against wars not just because of the financial cost. We have to be against wars because they are mass murder of human beings. And we have to say no to a war on Syria right now. We have to say it as loudly as we've never said no to any war. We have to say it because war is worse than anything it can be used to prevent or correct or fix. We have to say no. The idea that people might be killed with chemical weapons in Syria is not a justification for killing many times that number of people with cluster bombs and white phosphorus and napalm and hellfire missiles. These people do not need to be killed in greater numbers with the correct type of weaponry. They need to not be killed. We have to say this. Our wars are one-sided slaughters. We cannot be afraid to say this to people. Americans do not support the mass murder of civilians. They do not support one-sided slaughters. They don't know they are happening. The majority of Americans believe the war on Iraq benefited Iraq and cost us. When they agreed with us and wanted it ended year after year, they wanted an act of philanthropy ended. We have to explain to people that we destroyed that country, that we did not do it as a benefit, that there is not a nation to be pointed to that we've ever built, that there is not a humanitarian war that's ever served humanity, that Syria is not going to be the first, that if our government gave a damn, it would be looking at Bahrain, that we have a government that uses our emotions, our goodwill, our humanitarian sympathies for evil purposes and does not mean well. We have to be up to this opposition. I appreciated Kathy mentioning Jeremy Scahill, and I want to mention that there is a movie coming out this summer that is going to be in the big so-called mainstream movie theaters called Dirty Wars, and there is going to be the possibility to organize events like this one afterwards, but potentially to fill a bigger space in this gym with people who've never been here, and I encourage you to do that. And I would mention also that in Charlottesville, Virginia, where I am, where I live, we passed a resolution keeping drones out of Charlottesville, and we encourage the state of Virginia to keep drones out. And we now have a moratorium on drones in the state of Virginia, which the governor is going to sign with certain loopholes. And we need to do that everywhere. And finally, a website where I work called rootsaction.org. It has a huge coalition of every organization that I know of, and if yours isn't on there, please join us with a petition to ban weaponized drones from the world. And we're making this an international